Let's get started on Chapter 11, Administering Windows 7, and this is Part 1. In this chapter, in Part 1, we will look at troubleshooting practices, troubleshooting tools, the Microsoft Management Console, remote desktop, remote assistance, PowerShell, the Windows 7 boot process, post power on self-test, failures, drivers and service failures, and safe mode. And in Part 2, we will look at disaster recovery, startup and recovery dialog box. We will look at the system configuration tool at Windows RE, the recovery environment, branch cache, Windows backup, creating a system image, system restore, and previous versions. Let's start out on page 400, troubleshooting practices. And in troubleshooting almost any problem has essentially 7 steps. The first step would be to establish the symptoms. For example, Bob can't get to the internet. 2, identify the affected area. Now, is this just Bob who can't get to the internet, or how about other people? And then I see that I can't get to the internet either. Therefore, the affected area is not just Bob's computer, it's everybody on our segment. Step 3, established what has changed. Well, if I think back, I see that we recently installed a new switch on the segment where Bob is. So, step number 4, we select the most probable cause. The most probable cause is either we didn't configure the switch the right way, or it's a bad switch, or maybe the cables aren't plugged in. So then step 5 would be implement a solution, and that would be either swap out a switch if we think it's a bad switch, or reconfigure the switch, or just make sure the cables are plugged in. Then step 6 would be test the results to see whether or not Bob can get to the internet. And if he can, then we've solved the problem, and then we should document the solution, so if the same thing happens to somebody else, they will know where to look. Troubleshooting tools. On page 405, some of the major troubleshooting tools are WinRE, Windows Recovery Environment, the bootable DVD, Device Manager, which I know you are familiar with, Windows Backup, System Restore, Task Manager, Performance Monitor, which we do in a different chapter, and the Microsoft Management Console. So let's start out with the Microsoft Management Console. And I know you're already familiar with the Computer Management Console. The Computer Management Console allows us to look at the event viewer, or to create users, or to look at performance, or to run Device Manager, or to create and format a volume, or to look at services. This is the Computer Management Console. Now, the Microsoft Management Console is very similar to the Computer Management Console. The difference is you load only the snap-ins that you want to load, and a snap-in is an app. The Microsoft Management Console can be used to manage the local computer, and it can be used to manage a remote computer. So to bring up the Microsoft Management Console, we click on Start and we type MMC, and we hit Enter, and this brings up a blank Microsoft Management Console. So then what we do is we load the apps that we need. I click on File and select Add Remove Snap-in. Snap-in is another word for an app. I select Add Remove Snap-in, and whichever snap-in I want is the one that I load up. I could select Performance Monitor or Print Management. In this case, I want to select Local Users and Groups, followed by Next. This snap-in will manage the local computer, which is what I want for right now. I click on Finish, and now you can see I can create local users and groups for my own local computer, where I am. Now, we can also manage remote computers. So if I select Add Remove Snap-in for local users and groups and click on Add, it now asks me if I want this snap-in to manage a remote computer. So I can create users and groups and configure the remote computer. I select another computer, I click on Browse, and I select another computer. It could be in the domain or it could just be a work group, and I'll select this one called Shiv PC. And now you can see that I can either create users and groups on my local computer or on a remote computer. So you can do that for many different snap-ins, either for just your local computer or for the remote computer. Microsoft Management Console allows you to manage the local computer or a remote computer. Now let's look at remote desktop as part of remote management. And if you have a situation where there's another computer you have to configure, but it's at a remote location and you don't want to get in the car and drive over to that remote computer to do what you have to do, create a user, delete a user, reset somebody's password, format a disk. What you can do is from your own computer connect to that remote computer using a remote desktop, and then you can remotely configure that computer without having to go there. So to start remote desktop, you click on the Start button, and then we select Remote Desktop Connection. And then under Remote Desktop Connection, we type in the IP address or the computer name of the remote computer. We click on Connect, and then it connects me to the remote computer. And now you can see in this window I have a remote desktop connection. So if I click on Start and Control Panel, anything I configure here in the Control Panel will actually be configured on the remote computer. If I click on this Start button, it will run programs on the remote computer. Now if I select the very bottom left Start button, then I would be running programs on my own computer. So it's this window right here, Remote Desktop Connection, that allows me to remotely configure and manage a remote computer. To enable remote desktop, you go into Control Panel, under System and Security, and into System, and then you select Advanced System Settings. You select Advanced System Settings, and under Remote Desktop, you clear the checkbox that says Don't Allow, and then you select the radio button that says Allow connections from computers running any version of Remote Desktop. And then when I do that, then that allows me to remotely connect to that computer. That's Remote Desktop. Very convenient. Remote assistance is very similar to remote desktop. The difference is the user sends a message to the network administrator, you or me, that says, I'm stuck. Give me some help. I can't figure out how to print. I can't figure out how to change my fonts. So to enable remote assistance, it's right where remote desktop was. You go to Control Panel, System and Security, System, and under Advanced System Settings, okay, we just did Remote Desktop. Now at the top here, we have Remote Assistance. They're really very similar. So you click on this checkbox, and that will allow remote assistance connections to this computer. So then when a user is having a problem, the user can send an invitation to you or me, the administrator, to say, help me with this computer, take over my monitor, remotely control it. So to create an invitation, the user would click on Start, and then under Maintenance, under Windows Remote Assistance, the user would select Invite Someone You Trust to Help You. They select that. And they could send an email, or they could send the invitation as a file. So if we select Save Invitation as a file, then the user could save the invitation to the network administrator's computer. I mean, it would really be easier to use email, but another way to do it would be simply save that invitation to a shared folder on the administrator's computer. And then here's a password that the user has to communicate to the administrator, so they got to send them another email or just tell them on the phone. And then you or I, when we get the invitation, we respond to it and we take control of the user's workstation. We try to help them out. So we get the invitation, could come in email, could come as a file. In this case it came as a file. We select the invitation and it says enter the password. So we type in the password that the user had to communicate to us. We click on OK, and now you can see in this window here, this is the Windows Remote Assistant. So it's nearly identical to Remote Desktop, but the difference is the user can see what you are doing. So then what you or I would do as the network administrator is we would select Request Control, and then the user would see on his or her screen, would you like to allow the administrator to share control? And they click on Yes on their end. And now you or I as the administrator can remotely control that computer, and we can say to the person, maybe we have them on the phone, they say, well, I can't figure out how to change my fonts or how to change the margins, and then we can show them. So we can remotely configure their computer while they are watching. So remote assistance is very much like Remote Desktop. The major difference is the user sends an invitation and the user can see what's going on, but otherwise Remote Assistance and Remote Desktop are nearly identical. Remote Desktop Configuration Client, there are tabs for display, local resources, programs, and experience. So if I go to the Remote Desktop connection, we already did General, which is where you specify the IP address of the destination computer. Now under Display, you can configure the size of the Remote Desktop window, and you can also configure for the color depth. Under Local Resources, you can configure it such that when you're connected to the remote computer, when you print, it could either print to a printer connected to the remote computer or print to the printer which is connected to your local computer. Under Programs, we can configure a startup program such that as soon as somebody connects using a remote desktop, then it immediately kicks off a program. In this case, it's the Computer Management Console. And then under Experience is related to bandwidth. If this remote desktop connection is going to be over a high-speed connection, then the person using the remote desktop will get the Windows 7 visual experience, the 3D and the translucent stuff and all that stuff that makes Windows 7 look so cool, but it takes more bandwidth. If the person is going to be connecting over a slower connection, then you select slower connection and it clears these checkboxes, and then the user is not going to get the desktop background or font smoothing or show window contents while dragging, but it won't look as good, but it'll be faster and it'll take less bandwidth. Windows Remote Management using Windows RS. Windows RS is remote command line management, and to enable it on the computer that you want to remotely configure, you go to the command line and type winrm space quick config, and what quick config does, it simply enables that computer to be remotely configured. And then from your remote computer you use winrs to execute command line commands. So you would type winrs-r, the name of the remote computer, -u, the name of the user you'll be logging onto is that remote computer, usually administrator, -p, the name of the password, followed by the command line command that you want to execute. Here's an example. If you want to create a user on a remote computer, you type winrs-r, remote computer, workstation 1, the user is administrator, the password is password1, and the command which is used to create a local user is netuser bob-add, and it's kind of a hard way to do it. It's it's hard, but the advantage is, since it's the command line interface and not the graphical user interface, it's better for slower connections. It takes much less bandwidth to do. The command line interface typically takes less bandwidth, and you're probably already familiar with the command prompt, what they call the DOS prompt, the command line interface. If you click on Start and you select Command Prompt, this takes us to the command prompt, which is also called the DOS prompt. DOS stands for Disk Operating System. And you could type a command such as dir. Now, if you click on Start and you select Windows PowerShell, you can bring up Windows PowerShell. And Windows PowerShell, it's a command line interface, and it looks like old DOS. But if you type get-help space asterisk, which means get help for all commands, it gives you a list of the many, many, many commands which Windows PowerShell has. So Windows PowerShell it's a command prompt. It's very similar to the DOS prompt, and the difference is it just has a heck of a lot more commands, and it can be used for scripting, which means writing programs or batch files to automate processes. Troubleshooting Windows startup issues, page 417. Let's start out with the Windows 7 startup process. There are 8 steps in the Windows 7 startup process. Our textbook only lists 6, but I divide it into 8 tasks, maybe because I got 6 and 7 could be combined into one task. So let's look at the 8 steps in the Windows 7 startup process. The first thing that happens when you turn the switch on the computer is electricity goes to the BIOS chip, and it runs the POST, the power on self-test. Now the power on self-test is where the BIOS chip sends a signal to the hard disk to test it. And if the hard disk sends a signal back, well then that's good. That means the hard disk is connected. But if the hard disk is bad or not connected, then a signal is not going to come back, and the computer will fail the power on self-test, and you'll get an error message on the screen that says a post-test failure, a hard disk failure. That's the power on self-test. But ideally everything's fine. The hard disk is good. After the power on self-test runs, then the BIOS reads the master boot record. And as you know, the master boot record is the first track and the first sector of any hard disk. And the master boot record points to the active bootable partition 3. The master boot record points to the active or bootable partition, and usually the active or bootable partition it's almost always going to be the C drive, but you could make it the D drive. And then when the BIOS goes to the bootable partition, it finds the boot manager and it loads the boot manager. Now you've seen the boot manager many times before. Whenever you turn on a Windows 7 machine, you see the boot manager, and particularly if it's a dual boot machine. And this is a dual boot machine right here. It's got Windows 7 installed and Windows Vista. So you could put your cursor on either one and boot to either one. So this is the dual boot, this is the boot manager. After the boot manager is loaded, the system reads the boot configuration data file. And the user selects the operating system. The user puts his cursor on either Windows Vista or Windows 7, presses the Enter key. And after the user selects the operating system, then the operating system is loaded into memory. And the operating system is called ntosKernel.exe. NT OS is the operating system, and kernel. So that's the operating system file. The operating system is loaded into memory, and if you want to look at ntosKernel.exe, you go to the C drive, so the Windows 32 folder, and that is Windows ntosKernel.exe. That is the operating system. Whatever you do, don't delete that file. After the operating system is loaded into memory, then the operating system reads the registry so it can learn its own name and IP address. The registry as you know, there's the registry editor, is a configuration file that has all configuration parameters, such as the computer's DNS name and the computer's IP address. So the NT operating system, when it loads into memory, reads the registry so it knows what its name and IP address is. Then the operating system loads the login service. The login service is a service that allows the user to log in. What the login service does is it presents the login screen, and then the user can type his username and password. So at this point, when we see the login screen, that's considered fully booted. So you can see that there are 8 steps in the Windows 7 startup process. Now let's move on to potential failures during the startup process. Well, one would be power on self-test failures. You turn the computer on and you get a power on self-test that says 1701 post hard disk failure. And the reason you get a post error message, it could be because you really have a bad hard disk, or it could be there's just a poor connection to the hard disk, or it could be that they're incorrect BIOS setup settings. Now, you recall what the BIOS setup is. The BIOS setup allows you to set the time and the date and the boot order to identify where it's going to boot from. And common BIOS setup errors is that the wrong boot order is set. Typically, the boot order is going to be, it first tries to boot from the DVD, then it tries to boot from the hard disk. But if you mistakenly configure it to try to boot from the USB drive, then, and there is no USB drive, then it's not going to boot. So you'll have to correct the BIOS setup. And if you are missing startup files, then that can be fixed by running Windows RE, recovery environment. That's the repair DVD, which we will do in just a few minutes. Driver and service failures. Let's say you accidentally load the wrong driver. Let's say you load the wrong video driver and then your monitor looks all funny. So if you load the wrong driver, one real nice thing about Microsoft, if you go into Device Manager, you will see that when you load a driver, it very politely makes a backup of that driver. So if you have loaded the wrong driver and you're sorry and you want to unload that driver, you can go into Device Manager and select Driver Rollback. A very nice feature, Driver Rollback. But what if you've loaded the wrong driver and that wrong driver prevents the system from booting at all? That's when you go into safe mode. You go into safe mode, you go into Device Manager, and then you roll back that driver that's screwing the system up. To go into safe mode, you turn the computer on, you press F8 upon boot up, and you select safe mode. Notice safe mode only starts Windows with the minimum number of drivers. So safe mode loads almost no drivers. Well, it loads the keyboard drivers, but not the video drivers. So if you go into safe mode, then you can go into Device Manager, and then you can roll back or disable that wrong device driver that you incorrectly loaded. What if a faulty service prevents normal booting? Well, similar procedure. You boot to safe mode, and then you go to the services console, and you can disable that service. So let's say you think the DHCP service is preventing normal boot, for example. So what you do is you boot to safe mode, and then you go into the Microsoft Management Console, the Computer Management Console, under Services, under the DHCP client, and then you can go and disable that service, assuming you have some services preventing the system from properly booting. Advanced boot options include safe mode, which allows you to roll back drivers. Another advanced boot option is called Last Known Good. Last Known Good, what it does is it allows you to roll back the registry. If you think you have a corrupted registry, then you would roll back the registry by selecting last known good. So with advanced boot options, if you get the wrong drivers or services which are preventing normal boot, boot to safe mode, go into device manager and roll back the driver or go to the services console and disable the service. If it's a corrupted registry, then you use last known good, which loads a backup of the registry. And this concludes part 1 of chapter 11.